Hello, it is Alex, and I am looking at a high contrast photograph in Lightroom. This is of course not what I saw on location, but I want to point out something here. You see, despite the fact that the highlights were very bright here in this post-sunset picture, I chose an exposure bias of +1 stop. Why did I do that? To capture as much shadow detail as possible. Digital sensors are quite good at recovering shadow detail and not so great at their latitude in the highlights. So it is important to expose high contrast scenes that we want to develop from a single exposure as bright as possible, while also not blowing out the highlights. This technique is known as expose to the right, and what's meant is the right side of the histogram here, of course, where the highlights are. You can see in this photo I have already applied a number of small adjustments here with these new edit indicator dots of Lightroom Classic version 12.3. In the basic panel I added some deviations from my raw defaults that match what would actually happen if I didn't have any of my own raw defaults. I also cropped the image slightly, and I removed sensor dust here to not bore you with that tedious task. Before I begin to work with the sliders here to work this photograph into a more natural looking scene the way I perceived it on location, I want to point out that the default here is Adobe Color as a profile, and that this profile already has an amount of contrast that is beneficial for an average exposure, but not for a high contrast scene because it has a lot more contrast than I find desirable. I found that for my camera's color rendition, the camera matching profiles that Adobe provides are much better, and the camera neutral profile here provides the flattest contrast rendition that I want to use as a starting point. Alternatively, if you like the color rendition of Adobe, then Adobe Neutral would be a similar starting point. I choose camera neutral, and that is in fact my raw default here for rendering these photographs when I import them. And you see what has happened is that the histogram immediately responded to this. This sharp spike in the highlights went away, the shadows came out here a little bit and already have more definition. Very beneficial. Next thing that's worth evaluating here is the white balance, and the tint at -21 towards the green is not accurate. Why? Because it was a post-sunset scene here, and there was actually some of this typical purple twilight glow in that scene. The camera picked that up, and auto white balance tries to neutralize colors, eliminating the glow that I actually want in the photo. Maybe it's a little bit too cool here, so I warm up that scene a little bit. About there. Can always make fine adjustments later. So now we're at the point where we can actually begin working on the tones themselves. And normally I'd be very much tempted to simply drag the highlight slider down and then push the shadow slider up, but it is far better to begin with exposure, because these two sliders work around the midtones. In fact, when I move my mouse pointer here into the histogram, you see here is the area of shadow, here is the area of highlights, and in the center, the middle of the histogram, where the midtones are, is exposure. So it is advisable, before beginning to work with these sliders, to work with exposure first and establish the midtones wherever you want them to be. And that goes a little bit into the direction of the zone system, where you make a deliberate choice where which tone in the scene falls onto that zone system. Of course, I'm not going to go into those zones here. I just increase my exposure by maybe like 2/3 of a stop to get those rocks into a range where I like them better, where they have more definition. These weren't really mid-tones. There were in fact very few mid-tones. Maybe the lake surface would be a good area. And when I look at the histogram here, the brightness values, red, green, blue, about 60%. That is actually a good representation of mid-tones here. So now that I've established this, I can reduce my highlights and get this sunset sky into the range where I really want it. And I can increase my shadows to bring detail into the foreground here. So that looks like a much better representation of the scene already. However, as good as digital sensors are in recovering detail from the shadows, you've seen that these shadows here were essentially underexposed. Since I like to work with a single exposure, it is worth zooming in here. I choose a zoom of 200% because I have a retina display with a really high resolution. I find that zooming to just 100% doesn't really let me accurately inspect the detail. And we can see that there's quite an amount of noise here in that scene, in those shadows here. And it just so happens that Lightroom Classic version 12.3 has this new AI-based denoise feature. Clicking on this button here brings up the Enhance preview, where I can adjust my noise reduction. The value here, the amount, is something that can be tricky to determine, of course. I'd maybe go into an area that is a little bit lighter here and contains both darker shadows and lighter highlights. And then one approach would be to go all the way to 100, where everything looks very flat and soft, and then make my way down until I have a good combination, a good compromise between noise reduction and detail. Or I could set the amount to 0, which still includes color noise reduction, and then go upwards until I have reduced noise somewhat and also have a good amount of detail here still. The important thing for me here is that I am beginning to incorporate the possibilities of AI-based noise reduction, in particular for high contrast scenes where I have dark shadows, into my work in the field. I know that I can substantially reduce the noise here without killing detail thanks to this new AI denoise. So I can underexpose the shadows a lot and still will get an image that has a good detail quality here in the end. Since I have already worked on the photo, the application of AI denoise here takes a little bit longer. So I'm going to start this and speed up the video while we wait. And here we are back with our AI denoised image. Lightroom tells us denoise has been applied to this photo, which is a DNG file now. It is not my NEF RAW file anymore. And now that I have done this preparation work, I can work on individual areas of the photo to further improve the overall rendition. The first thing I think I'd like to address is still some more of the sky, because that's very bright here at the top and the eye kind of escapes there. So I would use a linear gradient here. Maybe I begin with about -1 stop and just place it here at the top, and I feather it out really far. rotate it a little bit more towards the brightest part of the sky. And that kind of contains the eye a little bit more here. I like that. And then we have the rocks here in the foreground, which are a nice element with a lot of texture and detail, and I think this needs to come out a little bit more in the photo so that we're not trying to stare into that too much, and make it clearer that this detail is really there. This is a freeform adjustment, so I would choose a mask with a brush. As usual, my flow is set to 50 so that I can brush over an individual area multiple times. My density is set to plus 100 because I like to apply this here to the maximum, and I have the lower flow anyway. And for this particular adjustment, I would choose a whites adjustment, pushing only the lighter parts of the image a little bit further up. And I use a relatively large brush here, and my feather is also very big so that I create smooth transitions. And you see, just brushing whites over this here brings out this last light of the day quality on these rocks nicely, and on that little plant here in the center. It just improves the rendition. I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller and go over the top area here as well. And looking at it now, these rocks have slightly cool tones in them that I'd maybe like to eliminate and just increase the temperature to make them warmer and bring some of that twilight glow purple in there as well. That looks pretty good. If I'd like still more definition, I could play with the clarity slider, but that makes it kind of hard. Or I could use the texture slider, which affects more of the mid-tones and doesn't increase that local contrast too much. Maybe here's a good spot. And with that, I think I have achieved a pretty nice rendition of the image that much more closely resembles what I've actually seen with my own eyes. The important things here, again, one, expose to the right to have shadow detail without blowing out the highlights, and two, remember that AI denoise enables us to get great detail quality in shadow areas here from a single exposure. So I'm incorporating that into my on-location work instead of merely considering AI as a crutch that I can reduce to salvage photographs. I hope you find this video helpful, and until next time, bye!